Good morning and a very warm welcome to you all. We'll give it a couple of minutes just for people to file in. It'd be fantastic to get you to jot down where you're dialing in from, location-wise or organisation. It's always wonderful for us as panellists to hear that, and then the other attendees as well. I'm dialing in from Cheltenham in Melbourne on a warm Melbourne summer's day as usual. And we'll be introducing the other panellists shortly. Claire's going to be manning the chat there, as you can see. Welcome Belinda, welcome Carmel, welcome Grant, Hannah, Isabel, Jennifer, welcome Joff, Kirsten, Costa, Lachlan, Martin, Maxwell, Michael, a very warm welcome to you all. We're just going to give it a minute or two for everyone to file in. Welcome Sarah, Tom, Virginia. Wonderful to see so many people joining on what is a very busy time of year for us all, isn't it? So it's great to have you on board. Welcome Sarah from Toll in Perth. Great to have you with us. Welcome, Christopher. Very warm welcome. Sheila in Parkdale, just down the road. Great to have you with us. Ballarat, Victoria, Joff. Welcome, Adam, from the Central Coast in New South Wales. Great to have some other states dialing in as well. Very good. So we might kick it off. So again, thank you all for making the time to join us for our webinar today, Road Safety and Prevention in the Heavy Vehicle Space. I'm Andrew Bird, your host from Foundstone Advisory. And I'm also joined by Claire from Foundstone, who'll be keeping across the chat and the Q&A. Welcome, Claire.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here.
So before we introduce our panelists, just wanted to really acknowledge the people that have made the time to dial in and join us today. We've got a really broad spectrum, people joining us from state and local governments, first responders, transport companies, education providers. So it's really heartwarming to see that people are really getting involved in this conversation. And that's really what we're wanting it to be today. We're not coming, of course, with all the answers, but we're really looking forward to hearing from, of course, the panelists and you as an audience through the chat and Q&A function. So just a brief bit of housekeeping before we move forward. We're going to keep, again, this very interactive and conversational, hopefully. We've got a few slides that we'll be presenting to add some real value and richness from the research. But largely, this is quite an unscripted conversation. So we deliberately have kept it that way because we want to hear from you on the chat and the Q&A, and we'll be turning to any questions or comments as we move through. So just to set the scene briefly, and a bit of context behind today's forum, myself and Foundstone and Claire, we've had the privilege of listening and learning and engaging across the road safety sector, including a number of the panelists for a couple of years now. So talking and listening to across the broader state communities, government, corporate and general road users. And the overriding theme back to us is really people want to hear more genuine conversation so that we can all learn and listen and continue to influence change. We want to acknowledge that we're not coming today saying we've got one solution, or there's not just one group or organisation who is responsible for road safety and prevention. And I think looking back on the last 18 months, for me anyway, when we look at COVID and lockdowns, I think I've become a lot more aware of that we are all part of a larger system. The packages arriving on our doorsteps, the supermarket shelves being full, I think we've probably noticed that more even as consumers, and how those goods get delivered and how critical it is. And I know myself, I've developed and are still developing a lot more respect and empathy for those in the heavy vehicle sector and broader. So I just really wanted to acknowledge that from my own perspective. So today, the intention of today is to dig a bit deeper into the research that MUARC has conducted. We're going to be listening to some of the really kind of behind the scenes insights and how the report came about, some of the headline contributing factors, and then look at collectively how we can look at some of the potential interventions. So again, today is about listening to yourselves on chat and Q&A, and hopefully we bring some fresh insights for you to continue your own conversations in your own community. So without further ado, we'd like to introduce the panel. So first up, we're privileged to be joined by Stuart Newstead. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us. Thank you for making the time. Stuart is the Associate Professor at Monash University's Accident Research Centre, known as MUARC. Stuart leads the Centre's Injury Analysis and Data team. He holds a PhD in Applied Statistics and has worked at MUARC since 1993, developing specific expertise in a wide range of safety research areas. And Stuart is the co-author of the research that we'll be going through today, the report titled An Analysis of Heavy Vehicle Safety Performance in Australia. And Stuart, I remember personally listening to your insights 18 months, a couple of years ago when we were in the heart of lockdowns and COVID. And I just remember that you distilling down for a number of us listening to that, some of the very practical and common sense ways that we can address this. So again, thank you for joining us today and looking forward to hearing from you in a bit. Next, we have Bernadette Nugent. Welcome, Bernadette.
Thanks, Andy.
Bernadette is the CEO of Road Trauma Support Services Victoria. And Bernadette leads the organisation. Road Trauma Support Services Victoria, they provide education and counselling services across the broader state communities. Prior to being CEO, Bernadette was the manager of counselling support services. So has had many years of real understanding and human understanding of the different perspectives across safety, prevention and road trauma. And Bernadette's been engaging across various corporate organisations, government partners, transport companies, education providers, and is co-developing education solutions to develop genuine partnerships. Last, but very much not least, welcome Chris Harrison.
Hi.
Great, you could join us today, Chris. Chris is the Manager of Education at RTSSV. Chris has spent more than 25 years working as a counsellor and educator. And for the past 15 years, Chris has been heading up the education division of RTSSV, working across prevention and cultural change. Chris has got a real belief in the need for ongoing cross-sector collaboration, where individuals and organisations, both not-for-profit, government and business sectors, really pool their resources for the right outcomes. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from Chris today in terms of the power of sharing lived experiences and real life stories and the positive impact this can have. So thank you all the panelists for joining, and we're looking forward to some real rich conversation today. So let's kick it off. Bernadette, as the CEO of Road Trauma Support Services, I know you're out in the community, many organisations, shapes and sizes. It'd be great perhaps just to hear from you initially of what you're seeing across the sector in terms of how we can continue to raise awareness. And we held a previous webinar around the why of road safety and prevention a couple of months ago. It'd be great to hear from you a bit more about that if we could.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, look, I guess from our perspective, we're always looking at it from the why. We want people to really think about what have they got to lose? What have we personally, what's our personal investment in road safety? And we do that because we are sadly, we hear hundreds of stories every year from people who've been impacted by road trauma, and it's life-changing, and people need to understand this. And there's a continuum of severity, of course, when we talk about road trauma, but I think what often goes unnoticed and underestimated is that even people who are involved in incidents that may appear to be fairly benign, it can still have a life-changing impact for a significant period of time. So as you mentioned before, we've been working really closely with the transport sector, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months. And what we're finding as a result of those very rich conversations that we've had, what we're seeing and hearing from these transport companies is if they're willing to have the conversation with us, and if they're willing to look at their organisation through a safety lens, then we know that these are the organisations that do take road safety really seriously. They take the safety of their drivers seriously, and they take the safety of other road users really very seriously. So I guess this report from us, from our perspective, look, it was a real eye-opener and really compelling. And what we're trying to do through having these webinars is really get people to stop and listen, and have that understanding that if we don't do things differently, if we don't implement interventions, the results are quite devastating. So we know, though, what we do know, there isn't one solution. There has to be a broad approach to not just heavy vehicle and road safety, but everyone's who uses our roads. So that includes all aspects such as road infrastructure, vehicle design, affordability, legislation, but it also means community buy-in. So and I guess from an RTSV perspective, that's where we come in. We're really trying to get community buy-in, and we do a lot of that through our amazing volunteers who are our personal speakers who get out there in the community and tell their story. But to raise awareness and get people to start thinking about what responsibility they can take to make a difference.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And I've heard you talk about a fair bit in terms of holistically how, we are all shared road users and we are part of a broader system. And of course, Stuart's going to go into a bit more detail on that in a second. But from what you're seeing around in the context of shared road users, can you tell us a bit about, again, what you're seeing there and perhaps some examples that you're seeing, how that's so important?
I guess generally, I know I'm generalising, but I think that generally the community, we tend to apportion a lot of blame to other road users. So whether or not I'm a car driver, I need to accept that there are going to be vulnerable road users such as cyclists and motorcyclists and pedestrians. And I'm also sharing the road with heavy vehicles. And I guess, Andrew, there are so many personal stories about where people's lives changed. And I know I use that expression a lot, but this is what happens. So for me, it's about, instead of externalizing and blaming, we need to internalize and take responsibility.
Yeah, it's so true. I think that having that mindset, and that's really the conversation that we're having today, is really about that, isn't it? I've heard you talk about that in other conversations, that taking that collective responsibility. And again, we're not saying that there's one organisation or one group of one cohort responsible, are we?
No, not at all. And
so,
I think it's really important to highlight too, when we talk about heavy vehicle safety, I don't want it to be misconstrued that we're pointing the finger at truck drivers. That's not what we're doing. It's like what I said before. This is a combined effort, and a combined group of solutions and interventions that need to happen. So a lot of the stories that I know I have heard from people in the past where they have been involved in a heavy vehicle incident, it wasn't the driver's fault. So it goes both ways, and we need to understand, by pure the actual sort of construct of a crash with a heavy vehicle, and what does that mean when you break it down into, you know, what's the likelihood of people being seriously injured? And obviously it's going to be higher, no matter whose fault it was or who was responsible.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate you making those observations. So thank you, Bernadette, for setting that scene. Really appreciate that. And I know Chris is going to be extending on that a bit later from a broader road trauma support services, what Chris is seeing in the education space. So looking forward to that. So now we're going to share a few slides that Stuart has kindly prepared from the actual report. And Claire's going to share those now. And I think as Bern, you summed up, you know, this report is really compelling. It's an eye-opener. And I think that the depths that Stuart and the team have gone to, when I read the report, yeah, it was certainly an eye-opener with the projections. So Stuart has prepared a bit of a summary. Of course, you can all read the report for yourselves. We can provide the link to that afterwards. But Stuart, again, thank you for making the time, and really looking forward to you distilling some of the key parts.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew. Before we start off, just acknowledge why do we do this work? Well, vehicle safety is a national interest. It's one of the cornerstones of the safe system. And so understanding how to make vehicles safe and to monitor how well we're doing in making vehicles safe is something that's of joint concern by most road authorities across Australia and New Zealand, but also from public policy perspective from our automobile associations as well. So our research program, which we call the Vehicle Safety Research Group, is actually a sponsor consortium of a number of road agencies, insurance companies and motoring clubs across Australia and New Zealand that have come together to support a research program undertaken by MUARC to articulate issues around vehicle safety performance. Their general aim is to conduct high quality research which actually informs future policy and practice aimed at improving vehicle safety across Australia and New Zealand. And I think it's a great model for research, everyone coming together with common issues to co-invest in finding evidence to inform solutions to the problem. So very much acknowledge the support of our sponsor group in this program. Thanks, Claire. So why is heavy vehicle safety important? Why are we looking at? When we talk about vehicle safety, most people naturally gravitate to the idea of the sort of regular small passenger cars we drive around. And in fact, they are the most important aspect of vehicle safety because they are involved in by far the highest proportion of crashes and determine the outcome in terms of injury in those crashes. But heavy vehicle safety shouldn't be ignored. And these aren't our figures. These are the figures collated by the Bureau of Transport Economics in Canberra. And it talks about some key significant statistics. Heavy vehicles, we know, are actually disproportionately involved in crashes that result in injury, but particularly in crashes that involve fatalities. Something like 16% of all road crash fatalities involve a heavy vehicle in the crash, compared to only 4% of injuries generally. So when a crash happens with a heavy vehicle, we know it's often quite catastrophic in terms of the injury outcome. 4 times as likely to be killed than injured potentially in those crashes. And as I say, in general, heavy vehicles are associated with more severe injury outcomes in those crashes. And that's in comparison to heavy trucks actually only accounting for about 2.4% of registrations, but approximately 7% of the total vehicle kilometres travelled in our nation. And yet again, you see even as 7% vehicle kilometres travelled with 16% fatality involvement, it shows you that heavy vehicles are a problem in terms of in-road trauma. And in fact, even when we look at a rate per kilometre travelled, we know that heavy vehicles are much higher rate of involvement per kilometre travelled than for a passenger car involved. And these are things that the federal government has pointed out. So heavy vehicle safety is important. Just next slide, please, Claire. And when we look at the injury outcomes, often people think, well, heavy vehicle, it's really about what happens to other people. But when we actually break down by the different types of heavy vehicles, so we look at rigid trucks, which are basically no articulation in the middle, articulated trucks, semis, B doubles, and our bus population, this shows you the breakdown of fatalities and serious injuries from heavy vehicle involved crashes and where the injury burden is from and who it relates to. So as we would have expected, about 2/3 of road trauma relating to heavy vehicle crashes is for the other road user that the heavy vehicle crashes into. So partner protection is a real problem for heavy vehicle involved crashes. But I think surprisingly, 1/3 of that road trauma burden is actually still to the driver of the heavy vehicle. And that's perhaps what people don't anticipate. They think typically that when a heavy vehicle is involved in a crash, it's about who they run over. But quite often, in 1/3 of all the trauma outcomes, it actually is the heavy vehicle occupant themselves. We'll get back to that in a minute. But often people also disproportionately focus on our biggest heavy vehicles, our articulated semi-trailers, B doubles. But in fact, the biggest road trauma burden comes from our rigid truck fleet. And that predominantly drives around our urban areas interacting with other vehicles. So that's just a bit of context of where the trauma burden comes from in the heavy vehicle space. Next slide, please, Claire. So what we wanted to know from this is, well, what is our heavy vehicle situation? Where is that trauma coming from, and particularly how much of it is related to the design and specification of our heavy vehicle fleet? There's lots of other things about use and licensing and all sorts of things that come in there. But a particular focus of the Vehicle Safety Research Group in the light vehicle space is saying, well, how is vehicle crash worthiness, how it protects its own occupants, how has that improved over time, and how much does that contribute to the trauma burden? And also from the perspective of when you run into someone, which we call a concept of aggressivity in a vehicle, how much trauma does it create to other people which you run into on the road as well, the collision partner. And so in this study, we really want to focus on that heavy vehicle related performance and see how that actually compares to light vehicles in terms of what we've achieved in improving that over time, and how it actually performs relative to a light vehicle. Now, unusually, perhaps I'll skip to the headline result from this study. And what we found as the headline was that if we can do nothing more to improve heavy vehicle safety, that we're expecting over the next 10 to 13 years, about a 23% increase in growth in fatalities and serious injuries arising from heavy vehicle collisions. So if we do nothing, this problem will get worse. And that's a really, I think, quite disturbing statistic, because we're generally used to in Australia things improving in terms of road safety. But in this area, we're actually saying, well, it may not, it may actually get worse. And so what I'll do in the next few slides is tell you a bit about why we came to that conclusion and how. So next slide, please, Claire. One of the first things we have to note in heavy vehicles, the heavy vehicle space, is that exposure of heavy vehicle travel is actually increasing at one of the fastest rates of any vehicle type. Here you can actually see our past exposure and our predicted future exposure broken down by our regular cars, which is the top line, then our rigid trucks, our articulated trucks, and buses. And what you can see from this, and these are, again, federal government figures collected through the ABS, is that we have some significantly high growth in heavy vehicle travel in the last 40 years, 30, 40 years. And on current trend, we expect that actual heavy vehicle total travel will actually overtake that for light vehicles on current trends in about the next 15 years. So heavy vehicle safety is becoming more important because the exposure is increasing rapidly. And that's what the sort of things Andrew talked about in his introduction, is that people are wanting stuff delivered. Consumerism is racing along. People want their goods. And to serve that, we have a heavy vehicle industry, and the demand on that industry is growing rapidly. And consequently, the travel exposure in those vehicles is also growing rapidly. So this is one of the primary drivers. So in terms of vehicle travel and risk, heavy vehicles could actually in the future overtake light vehicles eventually as a road safety problem. And that's a disturbing figure to start with, I think. Next slide, please, Claire. When we look at light vehicles, we notice that in terms of total road trauma, those vehicles, although travel is growing in our light vehicle fleet, trauma has actually dropped quite significantly over time. And that's largely because we have really improved the safety of our light vehicle fleet. This looks at, as an occupant of a light vehicle, your risk of being killed or seriously injured in a standardised crash as a standardised person, as a real measure of the contribution of the vehicle in reducing road trauma. And what we can see for this, compared to a vehicle manufactured, a light vehicle manufactured now, a vehicle manufactured 40, 50 years ago is about 4 times as likely to kill or seriously injure you in the same crash. So over this time period, we've actually reduced our trauma burden through light vehicle safety improvements by about 75%. And this is what's largely offset our exposure increases in the light vehicle fleet is safety improvements. So I've actually seen net trauma reductions from light vehicles over that time. And that's due to a range of things like introducing design standards, consumer programs to tell people which vehicles are safe and hence put pressure on the manufacturers to do better. All those things have combined to make significant improvements in light vehicle safety. The question we had was, of course, well, has that same pattern occurred in the heavy vehicle fleet? So we actually did a similar analysis and compared trauma trends in heavy vehicle safety over time, but as well as compare it to the light vehicle average as well. So next slide, please. So what do we find here? Well, a couple of surprising facts, I think, in terms of heavy vehicle, in terms of their ability to protect their own occupants in the event of a crash. Firstly, I think, and most troublingly, for every heavy vehicle type we studied, and we broke it down into light rigids, heavy rigids, articulated vehicles, big buses, small buses, for every vehicle type except heavy buses, the occupant protection performance, the risk of being killed or seriously injured in a crash for the heavy vehicle is actually worse than the average light vehicle. And that's astounding, I think, because we know that heavy vehicles have a natural advantage in mass and size. Your average prime mover is probably 30 times as heavy as the average light vehicle, yet we are not seeing occupant protection performance in those vehicles that's commensurate with what we expect and actually achieve in a light vehicle. The other thing that was also disturbing was our trends over time. While for some of the smaller heavy vehicles, we've seen improvements, so smaller rigid trucks, we've seen some evidence of some improvement over time. For the larger vehicle classes, there has been no measured improvement in their ability to protect their occupants in a crash in the last 40 years. So you saw 75% improvement for light vehicles, no improvement in most heavy vehicle classes. So it seems like certainly we have totally neglected the idea of actually working on improving occupant protection performance in our heavy vehicle fleet. And that's quite disturbing because it's not as if we don't know how to do it from looking at light vehicles. It's just that for whatever reason, we really haven't focused on it in heavy vehicles. Maybe because we thought it wasn't important, but I think this evidence shows you it actually really is important. And you've got to remember, for most people who drive these heavy vehicles, this is actually a workplace. So where we've focused on many aspects of improving workplace safety in particularly the last couple of decades, as the vehicle as a workplace, we've seemed to have achieved absolutely nothing. And that's quite disturbing. Thanks, Claire. The next aspect we looked at, okay, if you're hit by a heavy vehicle, what are the injury outcomes there? And not surprisingly, we know that colliding with a heavy vehicle as another road user, typically a light car or an unprotected road user like a motorcyclist, pedestrian cyclist, the outcome's not good. But this quantified how not good it is. And again, we can compare to light vehicle performance. For every heavy vehicle class, you're at least twice as likely to be killed or seriously injured when you're hit by a heavy vehicle. But for large articulated vehicles, that went up to nearly 4 times. So again, it's a problem. compatibility is a problem. How we fix that is an issue to contemplate in our discussions today. But the other, again, disturbing figure is that we've made no progress in improving that compatibility between heavy vehicles and other road users, which they collide with over the last 40 years either. In the light vehicle space, we have made some progress. It has been far less than we have in occupant protection performance. So it's an area generally in vehicle safety that we need to focus on. Vehicle compatibility and aggressivity are really areas we're not making great progress in, but particularly problematic in the heavy vehicle space. And so the question is, well, how do we improve that? What can we do about that to improve that? So just moving on to the final slide. Thanks, Claire. I think these few key results from this study talk about what our future challenges are in the heavy vehicle space. There's significant benefits that could be realised from improving the crashworthiness of heavy vehicles. We're starting to think about it, but we've got nowhere. The other disturbing fact is that a light vehicle lasts in our fleet about 20 to 22 years. So we've still got a really long turnover time to regenerate our fleet. For the heavy vehicle space, our heavy vehicle fleet is very old in Australia and it tends to last between 30 and 35 years on the road. So if we're going to start thinking about how to improve the crashworthiness of the fleet through better design and regeneration, it's actually going to take a very long time to make inroads in that, given the age of the fleet. Improving heavy vehicle aggressivity, what the damage it does to other road users, the injury risk it poses to other road users, is more difficult. There are some possibilities. We're seeing probably Australia lagging behind in areas of regulation in heavy vehicle safety. So adoption of active technologies to avoid crashes, adoption of passive safety features like underrun protection in our heavy vehicle fleet. Europe is well ahead of us in that space. We are starting to see some of the newer vehicles adopt crash avoidance technologies, because if you can't improve the compatibility, what you've got to do is say, well, how can we avoid the crash? And some of our new crash avoidance technologies, we're seeing a lot of these emerge in large proportions in our light vehicle fleet. We need to understand how to get them into our heavy vehicle fleet and make them work as well. And we certainly need to accelerate those safety improvements if we're going to have any chance of offsetting those exposure increases that I showed in the earlier slides. But the other way we can also address risk in heavy vehicles is improve the person inside too. So are there aspects around licensing that we can improve the standard of heavy vehicle driving? Are there licensing issues around light vehicles about people understanding the dangers of heavy vehicles and how to avoid them? I think when we do analysis of heavy vehicle fault attribution, only about 20% of heavy vehicle involved crashes is the heavy vehicle driver at fault. So really there's the questions about how do we improve the behaviour of light vehicle drivers around heavy vehicles and get them to understand the risks associated with them as well. And how do we then apply licensing and enforcement and penalties to try and improve those risks and reduce those risks as well. Issues like traffic separation, we know there's compatibility problem. How do we keep the light and the heavy vehicles and the vulnerable road users separate from each other in smart designs for our transport sector? And finally, how do we get people to understand the risks and think about what they need to do to improve the heavy vehicle space? So I think in summary, there's a lot we can do, but the evidence suggests there's a lot we haven't been doing. And I think it's become quite urgent, given we're seeing massive increases in future exposure projected, that we really need to be conscious of how we deal with. I know out there in the audience, there's a lot of people who work in this space, and there'll be a lot of great ideas. And I really look forward to hearing people's thoughts and opinions on where we might go next in this space to actually improve the system in terms of how we accommodate heavy vehicles. Absolutely necessary in our economy, but really a defined safety problem. So I'll leave that there and we'll pass on to the next panelist.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for sharing those insights, in a bit more detail on the context of the report. I think that's really important. You mentioned those organisations that were involved in funding and sponsoring, and then the detail you've gone through. I might just turn to a couple of questions. There's been some good and healthy and robust conversations on the chat, which I think is important because it's about us listening as a broader conversation. So if you don't mind, Stuart, I might just turn to a couple of those questions now. And there's been some on the chat comments in terms of heavy vehicle, light vehicle, and you've obviously addressed some of those. Adam's asking here, do these crash stats include or exclude intentional crashes?
They only exclude what the police exclude in official reporting. So things like suicide, medical events that are really can be shown to be not a real road crash, if you like. They have an ulterior cause. So, but intentional, perhaps yes. If it was a demonstrated suicide intentional, probably no. For fatalities, there's a fatality review board that goes through and excludes those crashes. But generally, anything that's reported to police as an official road crash statistic is in this analysis.
Right, thank you. And a broader question, and not obviously an easy one to answer, but in terms of the question here, taking your why is heavy vehicle safety important at face value? If we use light vehicles instead of heavy vehicles to deliver the Australian road freight task, would fatalities go up or down? I know it's yeah.
That is a good question because obviously we use heavy vehicles because they have an efficiency. You can put a lot of goods in a heavy vehicle and have a driver driving them around. If you were to distribute them amongst smaller vehicles, you'd have to balance that safety performance against the increased travel exposure that you had. It could be line ball. We haven't done those calculations exactly, but you can understand that there'd be absolutely a trade-off. And of course, it would probably economically increase costs as well because you've got many more drivers employed to do that. So I don't think that's necessarily a reasonable solution to this, given there's probably other design and technology solutions and road user solutions that we can actually employ to keep productivity up, but also improve safety as well. So I don't think that's actually a realistic solution to start driving everything around in cars or on Uber bikes or something.
Yes, yeah. All right, well, thank you. And I'll just take one more question and then we'll move on to Chris very shortly. It's a broader one. So given the use of the motor vehicle census data, do you believe the ABS decision to discontinue that series will impact Australian road safety policy making?
Absolutely. One of the big holes in road safety research has been good exposure data. Discontinuing a very valuable survey like that, I think, is a really bad decision because it at least gives us a basis on macro level travel estimates. If you don't do that, you have to find a good way of actually replacing that with something else. And maybe we have better solutions through technology now compared to how that survey was collected, but we do not want to see that data disappear. It is incredibly valuable to understand those exposure trends.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Stuart. We'll move on now just to broader conversation, Chris. So, Chris, I know I've had the privilege of learning, from you and the broader organisation, Road Trauma Support Services, Vic, over a number of years. In what you're doing, in the broader education and prevention space. So as we've been listening to Stuart, from a policy decision perspectives and broader perspectives, I know you're doing, a lot of work in the education space about how some of the research translates into more the on-the-ground practical aspects, and how you've seen collaborating between different organisations can be really effective. So can you perhaps share with us a bit about what you're seeing in that area in terms of translating the research?
I think one of the things that I have is probably more questions than answers. And I think, there's we have the research and it's like, how do we translate it on the ground? How do we bring the community along? And I noticed one comment in the chat before around the, communication and what we're actually saying and leaving that blame game, I guess, on who is responsible. And I guess, we hear from all sides of the stories when trauma and grief has been involved. And it's like the mental health and well-being of truck drivers has had lots of attention of recent time. And, you know, and some of those stresses that they've been having around complying with some of those regulations and around the enforcement blitzes, and, you know, that stress that comes with all of that is really heightening drivers' mental well-being. We've heard lots of, you know, data around suicide amongst, and I think that came up in one of the chats as well. So
yeah.
how do we bring the drivers along? How do we bring other road users and other users along to understand the research, Stuart, that and I guess that's a question as well, because I think that's really important about bringing people along, and I guess understanding, you know, why this research is happening and how it can actually keep them and other drivers safe on the roads. And I think that lack of understanding and really having some concept around goes back to what Bern said about the why, really understanding what all this means for them as the driver in those vehicles.
Certainly, and I thank you for addressing those. There's some really, you know, notes on the chat there from Sarah and Adam, so we certainly acknowledge those. So thank you for touching on that, because it is hugely important, isn't it? Because in your role, I mean, you see from a very human aspect, from very different perspectives on the roads, and, you know, Bern talked about, you know, us all as shared road users. You genuinely see things from very different perspectives, and, you know, talking to, you know, heavy vehicle operators, we have a lot of empathy for them as well in terms of the demand on them. So if we look at it from those different perspectives you're seeing, and again, you know, some of the, you know, the lived experiences that you listen to and then help have those lived experiences out in the community. Can you talk a bit about that, perhaps?
I guess, you know, some of the stories that we're hearing, you know, from drivers and from users, other vehicles out on the road that are connecting with trucks, it does, you know, for the truck driver themselves, you know, a lot of things seem to be kind of out of their control. They see things happening in front of them, and whether that comes back to what Stuart is talking about safety within the vehicle that can help prevent some of those crashes. But, you know, we see that interaction between the truck driver and other vehicles on the road, and, you know, you hear stories where, you know, someone way up in advance, you know, makes a choice to cross lanes, and, you know, the truck driver, being up higher, can obviously see this folding out in front of them, and have got to the point where they can't do anything about that, and they're going to crash into that vehicle in front of them, and for a whole heap of reasons, possibly being too close. I mean, they're in traffic, and obviously something to do with those safety features within the vehicles. And, you know, owner operators in particular, some of those stories that I've heard from them, you know, it's all around cost and you know, how do they get that the safest truck on the road. When you talk about 35, 40 years, I think Stuart used to mention, you know, how does that happen? Is there support? Is there, you know, where do we go? What are the solutions? I think I'm more interested in hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bernadette, I might bring you back in again in terms of when we look at the collaboration aspect between, you know, the various organisations at a state and federal level. I know, you know, you and your organisation, you know, focuses a lot on that in terms of, you know, Road Trauma Support Services Victoria have, you know, personal speakers, you know, the lived experiences of people that have been impacted. And you're seeing that, you know, the collaboration between organisations and sharing those insights on an ongoing basis is really important, isn't it? Because, you know, we've been through COVID, we're still going through COVID, And I've heard Stuart talk about that, mid last year. But perhaps again, from your perspective, Bernadette, from a collaboration point of view, is there anything particularly you're seeing in that space that is working well?
I believe there's a genuine desire to collaborate across government organisations. And for those people who have joined us today, who we've had conversations with, I'm really confident that we're all trying to work together to achieve better outcomes. And I think that the important thing is that each individual organisation, ours included, whether it be a government department, brings a certain particular element to the table. And we all look at things from different perspectives. But I genuinely believe with a shared desire to make a difference. So obviously we look at it very much from a people perspective. And the work that we do the work we've been doing recently with transport and logistic companies has very much been focused on driver wellbeing, to really look at the individual. And Stuart referred to the safe systems approach at the beginning, and that's definitely the people pillar. And each organisation has their own contribution to make. So it's vital. If we don't talk to each other and if we don't include each other, and there's been some amazing comments in the chat that has really got me thinking as well about different aspects and different outlooks, and what else should we be looking at. So I think we're going in the right direction, but I think there are so many things that impact road safety generally. Everyone needs to buy in. We're also trying to, and we have worked closely with local governments as well. It gets down to every level, I guess. That's what's important. We can't just focus on one level to be a quick fix. Then that won't happen. We won't achieve anything.
Certainly. Yeah, well, thank you for covering that context, because it's important. That's why we're having the conversation today, isn't it? Again, we're not saying this is this is a group of perspectives. We see there are, and as Stuart has outlined, there's so many pieces to the puzzle. So it's certainly important to acknowledge that. Stuart, there's a comment here from Adam in terms of, and again, this is not about pointing the finger at all, but in terms of the Federal Department of Infrastructure, and in terms of how much focus or potential room for improvement there on really addressing and using some of the powerful technology. I know you covered a bit of it, but are you able to comment on, even where Australia sits on this globally from a technology point of view?
Yeah, I certainly won't point the finger at the vehicle safety standards people in the Commonwealth. They're bound by working by a set of laws we have for developing vehicles and implementing vehicle safety technology in Australia. And I think it's not the department, it's the problem. It's the actually overarching laws on how the requirements and what's required to implement those laws that are actually the problem. They actually need addressing at a parliamentary level. I'll just go through some of the other comments that have appeared in the chat. Firstly, I'll apologise. I should never use the term aggressivity in the truck space. It's not pointing a finger at truck drivers. Aggressivity is equally, it's just a term we use for, and I should call it collision partner protection, because that's essentially what it's looking at. But so apologies if you've taken offence at that term. It's not meant to be pointing a finger at truck at being a big aggressive thing. It's equally used as cars as well. And I think it's fair to say that in terms of partnerships, there's a lot of leadership in the heavy vehicle space amongst the big trucking companies. We've seen some really exemplar behaviour in those big companies in how they specify their trucks, how they manage driver scheduling, how they manage their staff generally. It's really good stuff and absolutely leading the industry. I think the problem we have is that the transport sector is very, very broad. There's a lot of people involved in transport that don't consider themselves as transport workers because they have a truck at the nursery they drive, etc. So the question, I think, in the conversation is, how do we draw all those people that are involved in using heavy vehicles into the conversation so they can actually behave in the sort of exemplar ways that we've seen from our biggest trucking companies? And I think that's an important thing to consider, because it's not, they're great, but there's a whole raft of other people out there who are need the conversation to happen with them as well. And how do we start those partnerships is a good question.
Yeah, it's a great observation. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for turning to the chat there and acknowledging that. I think it's really important. I noticed note there. Sorry, Chris.
I was just going to say, I noticed in reading the report, Stuart, that in some of the safety components, and one of the comments that's just come up in people not utilising those safety things and actually, not connecting them. And there's some of the stories that I've heard from drivers in the past where, they don't put their seatbelts on because they're in and out all the time, or they click it in and, sit in front of it. But some of the other ones that are just being mentioned in here, so it's that reluctance. And some things that you often hear is, I want that full control rather than having control taken away of me within the vehicle. So is that part of the issue around, again, does it come back to not really understanding or knowing how to use the safety things that are in our vehicles, safety aids?
I think these questions apply equally to the light vehicle fleet as well, because a lot of people are suspicious. And I think it comes down to a need for a conversation between sometimes the engineers who are designing these systems and the human factors people, understanding how people use and respond to these systems. And I think there's actually a real gap in vehicle safety in that conversation as well, because we know there's a lot of people in their light vehicles who say, oh, this forward collision warning annoys the crap out of me, so I'm just going to turn it off all the time. And they then forgo the benefit that we've seen that it can actually produce in the real world. And I think in the truck space, it's probably even more magnified, because we have people who are really specialist training to operate these vehicles who believe that that they can probably do a better job from the technology. So I think getting these technologies right is actually really important to make sure they operate seamlessly and with great acceptability by the users as well. So I think that is really an important conversation. One of the really big holes we have in heavy vehicle safety and understanding these technologies is there's no really good data to tell us which trucks are fitted, which trucks aren't fitted with these technologies. So we can actually do really good in-depth research to see how they are working in practice. So we have to go to other methodologies like actually interviewing drivers and seeing how they're responding as well. And so there's a lot of work to do in that space, but there's a real big hole in the data we have to support actually understanding a lot of these areas in heavy vehicle safety that urgently need to be plugged.
Thank you for that question, Chris. I just wanted to turn to Lyndall on the chat there, acknowledge saying I'm a road crash rescuer and also a heavy rigid driver. And my belief in education is crucial, talking about light vehicles and heavy vehicles, and acknowledging, fatigue, time constraints and expectations. And I think that's what we're seeing, and we've heard about today, that there is a broader system there. And, COVID has certainly contributed to that. Chris, I know you touched on it before, but I just want to briefly touch on it again in terms of the lived experiences and that human element of people sharing, like Lyndall has kindly done on chat now. It's hugely important to continue that conversation, isn't it? In a very live and a human way.
I think, when you've got people hearing about some of those outcomes, it can be quite powerful in putting that why to some of those safety measures that need to be put into place. And I just think, people within the industries that have got that lived experience. We were talking at one of the industries of recent times, and a person, one of their supervisors had come in and they'd actually had a lived experience, and it actually brought a lot of the drivers along with him. I don't know, it was something around respect or a real understanding of what happens, and they were more able to really link that safety and adopt safer procedures as a result of that. So I think there certainly is a place, and it can be quite powerful when people do hear it from that perspective.
Certainly. And so, yeah, thank you for the work you do in that space.
Andrew, can I just add something? I've just been reading some of the chats too, and there's a bit of discussion around the collection of data and suicides again. And I tend to agree with Sarah in that I believe the statistics, we need to be careful how we collect data. And I sadly have spoke to several truck drivers over the years who were involved in a fatality where it was intentional, where the person took their own life and chose their truck. And the long-term trauma effects on them are devastating, many of whom couldn't drive again. But I believe that in how we collect data is really important, and mental health and the motivating factors behind someone taking their own life is incredibly important information to collect as well. So I just think it's a really complex issue in relation to road crash data as well as data around suicide. But we need to acknowledge that the impact on the drivers when this happened is devastating. And sadly, it happens a lot. And fortunately, the media, whilst I think the media, I agree with what Sarah said, you'll often hear a truck incident, particularly when there's been a fatality, and the inferences were that it was the driver's fault. But I think I know that certainly the television media and things have gotten a lot better at not reporting incidents that involve someone taking their own life for lots of varied reasons. But I think we've got a lot of work to do in that space generally. But I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge the impact on the drivers when this occurs.
And just to flow on from that, I think, after the crash kind of care, post-crash care, the ripple goes in many different ways for the driver that's caused a crash to those others and the family members that have been impacted. And we see a whole heap of different trajectories that either go down the criminal line or, into substance use. So a lot of times we're not aware of that ripple effect and the different trajectories that people's lives go in after that crash too. And sometimes, often, perpetuates ongoing behaviour. And, I certainly see a lot of that in the prison program that we work in, where there's a lot of truck drivers in there in comparison to other drivers. And a whole heap of different things that have gone on for them as part of that trajectory for them. And then, what does that happen when they come back out into the community as well? So I think, looking at it from that perspective is really important as well.
So true. And Sophia, thank you for everyone on the chat. We're going to wrap up now. We're nearly at 11. And thank you, Bernadette and Chris, for acknowledging that again. And Sarah, for sharing, what you're seeing at Toll Group, you've called out there specifically. So it certainly is, this is only one of many conversations that need to happen in that space, because it's a really tough subject, and I find it tough to speak on as a facilitator. But so thank you, Bernadette and Chris, for addressing that yourselves. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for the questions and your comments on chat. We really appreciate your really getting involved. And Stuart, thank you for sharing, those insights of the report, because I know it's, it's not easy then to talk about that in the collective view. So we really appreciate you distilling that down and giving us a bit of insight of the before and then what we can look at after the report as well. So thank you hugely from us all for that.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I don't have more answers, but at least we've got to acknowledge the problem to start with.
100%. That sums it up. And thank you, Bernadette and Chris, for all your contributions and sharing, what you're seeing. You talked about the broader mental health issues that we all need to address, the motivational factors and the ripple effect that this has, why it's so important. So
thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.
And thanks, everyone, for attending.
Thanks for making the time, and have a safe lead up in the next couple of weeks to Christmas.
Thank you.
Take care.